I had not expected the house to feel different. That is the first thing I want to tell you. Because when you have lived in a place for 53 years, when every room has been shaped by the particular habits of two people moving through it together, when the stairs know the sound of your step, and the kitchen window knows the particular angle at which you stand to watch the garden in the morning, you develop a sense of what that house feels like when it is simply empty, and what it feels like when something is wrong. I noticed it before I had even taken my coat off. I had spent the afternoon at the York Minster Conservation Workshop, as I do every Tuesday and Thursday, working alongside 3 other retired craftsmen on a collection of 18th century ecclesiastical documents that had been water damaged during some repair work to the north transept roof. It is painstaking work, the kind that requires complete attention, the kind where a wrong movement of the hand can undo hours of careful progress, and I find it, at 79, not only satisfying but necessary. Eleanor always said that the hands need to be kept purposeful. She was right about most things, Eleanor. She was particularly right about that. I came through the front door of the house on St. Mary's just after 5:30. The light was already going. York in the autumn loses its light early, and the street outside had that particular amber and shadow quality that the Victorian terraces along Bootham do so well, the old stone holding the warmth of the afternoon for just a little longer than the sky is willing to. I hung my coat on the hook in the hall, the hook that has been in that same position for 40 years, put there by a man from Micklegate who did odd jobs in the neighborhood and who charged £3 for an afternoon's work and stayed for tea and talked about cricket for 2 hours. I remember that afternoon vividly, which tells you something about the way certain small moments adhere to memory, while larger ones sometimes slip past without leaving much trace. I walked through to the sitting room, and I stopped. It took me a moment to identify what was wrong, because the room looked, at first glance, entirely normal. The armchairs in their usual positions, the bookshelves holding what they have always held, the fireplace, unlit at that hour, with the mantelpiece above it bearing its familiar collection of small objects accumulated over half a century of a shared life. And then I saw it. The oak display case beside the fireplace. I had made that case myself, 31 years ago. Made it from a piece of English oak that a colleague at the bindery had given me when he retired, in the way craftsmen sometimes pass things on. It sits on a small side table to the left of the fireplace and has a glass front with a simple brass catch. Inside, over the years, I had arranged a small collection of objects that held particular meaning to Eleanor and me. A pressed sprig of heather from a walk we took in the Yorkshire Dales on our first anniversary. A fragment of a letter written by my grandfather. A small silver brooch that had belonged to Eleanor's mother, and on a square of dark velvet, positioned at the center of the upper shelf, 2 rings. My wedding ring and Eleanor's. I had removed my ring on the evening Eleanor passed away. It was not a decision I made consciously. It was simply what happened. I was sitting beside her in the room where she'd spent her final weeks, and I took the ring from my finger, and I held it in my palm, and I sat there with both rings for a long time, and then I had placed them both in the oak case, together, as they had been for 53 years. I had not touched them since. The case was open, and the velvet square held only 1 ring. I stood looking at it for what must have been a full minute. The particular stillness of a man who has understood something, but is allowing himself the grace of a few additional seconds before he accepts it completely. Then I went to find Naomi. She was in the back room, the room that Jonathan and Naomi used when they stayed, which had gradually, over the past 18 months, become something between a guest room and a workspace for Naomi's business. She sells vintage decor, has done for about 4 years now, furniture, mirrors, ornamental pieces, things she sources from house clearances and estate sales and charity shops and markets, refurbishes or simply photographs well, and sells through an online platform. She is good at it. That has never been in question. She has an eye for what people will want before they know they want it, and she understands the particular appetite that exists, especially now, for objects that carry the suggestion of a history. She was packing something in brown paper when I came in, a small gilt mirror from the look of it. She didn't look up immediately. "Naomi," I said, "have you seen Eleanor's ring?" She looked up then, and what I want to tell you about the expression on her face in that moment is that it was not guilty. It was not startled. It was not the face of someone caught in something they wished they hadn't done. It was composed, settled, the face of someone who has made a decision they considered reasonable and has no particular expectation of being challenged on it. "I sold it this morning," she said. She said it the way you might say you'd posted a letter or returned a library book, as a simple statement of a completed action. I looked at her. "There was a buyer I've been in contact with for a few weeks," she continued, returning her attention to the mirror she was wrapping. "He specializes in antique jewelry. It was a good price. Victorian gold band. That weight. In that condition. Honestly, Edmund, it was just sitting there." She set down the mirror and looked at me directly. "Someone who's gone doesn't need gold anymore," she said. I have thought about that sentence many times in the months since she said it, about the particular philosophy it contains, about what a person has to believe, about objects, about memory, about the relationship between the living and the dead, in order to say it with that degree of ease. It is not a cruel philosophy, exactly. It is, in its own way, a practical one, a philosophy built on the conviction that things are only things, that sentiment is a kind of indulgence, that the world is better served by objects in active circulation than by objects preserved in the name of feelings that belong to the past. I don't share that philosophy. But I understood, standing in that back room looking at Naomi, that arguing with it in that moment would accomplish nothing. You cannot have a reasonable debate about the nature of meaning with someone who has just demonstrated, quite clearly, what they believe meaning to be worth. I heard Jonathan's footstep on the stair. He appeared in the doorway behind me, tall like his mother's side of the family, with the particular careful expression he gets when he has registered that something is wrong and is deciding how to respond to it. He looked at me. He looked at Naomi. Some rapid, silent calculation moved across his face, and then he turned and walked quietly back upstairs. I have known Jonathan for 52 years. He is my son. I know the full register of his silences, and that particular silence, the one he took with him up the stairs, was not indifference. It was the silence of a man who has seen something he doesn't know how to address, and has chosen, for the moment, to remove himself from the room rather than say something he hasn't yet thought through carefully enough. I went upstairs myself, not to my bedroom, to the small study at the back of the house, the room that has always been mine, the room where I did my reading and my writing and, in earlier years, the detailed technical work that bindery projects sometimes required me to bring home. It is a narrow room with a single window that looks out over the back garden, and it contains a walnut writing desk that I have had since I was 34 years old, a gift from Eleanor on the occasion of a professional achievement I was characteristically reluctant to celebrate, and that she characteristically insisted on marking properly. The desk has a key, a small brass key that I keep on my personal key ring, which I have kept on my person every day for 45 years. I unlocked the center drawer and took out the notebook. It is a navy blue notebook, cloth-bound, with no markings on the cover, about 200 pages, the kind of notebook you might find in a good stationer's. Nothing remarkable from the outside. I have refilled it twice over the years, transferring the previous contents with care, because the original bindings had started to soften, and I wanted everything in one continuous volume that would last. I sat down at the desk. I opened the notebook to the next blank page. I wrote the date, the exact time. I sat for a moment with the pen in my hand, and then I became aware that I was being watched. Naomi was standing in the doorway. She had followed me upstairs, which surprised me slightly, not unpleasantly, just unexpectedly. She leaned against the doorframe with her arms folded and looked at me with an expression that was more curious than contrite. "Still writing in that little notebook?" she said. There was a lightness in her voice that I recognized. It was the lightness of someone who is mildly amused by what they consider an old man's harmless eccentricity. The notebook, in her view, was of a piece with the display case and the pressed heather, and the careful maintenance of objects and habits that had outlived their original purpose. I closed the notebook without answering her. She stood there for another moment, and then she went back downstairs. I sat in the study for a long time after that. Now, I want to tell you something about this notebook, because it is the heart of everything that follows, and I think it's important that you understand what it actually is before I go any further. 3 years before Eleanor passed away, she began experiencing some difficulties with her memory. Not suddenly. These things are never sudden, whatever it feels like at the time. Gradually, the way light changes in the afternoon, so slowly that you don't notice the room getting darker until you realize you've been sitting in it for some time without being able to see clearly. She would forget small things at first. An appointment, a name she knew, the word for an object she'd been using for 40 years. We saw her doctor. We had the conversations that follow those conversations. And then Eleanor and I sat down together one evening, here, in this house, at the kitchen table with the garden dark outside and the radio on low, and we talked about what was likely to come, the way two people who have built a life together are obliged to talk about the things they would rather not. Eleanor said something that evening that I want to tell you exactly as she said it, because I have never found a better version of it. She said, "Edmund, I'm not afraid of forgetting things. I'm afraid of the things being gone once I've forgotten them, as if they never happened." And I said, "They'll still have happened." And she said, "Not if no one remembers them properly." We sat with that for a while, and then she said, "Will you write them down? Not the important ones. Anyone can write down the important ones. I mean the ordinary ones. The ones attached to ordinary things, because those are the ones that disappear first." So I started the notebook. Every evening, before bed, I would choose one object from somewhere in the house, something we walked past every day, something so familiar it had become invisible, and I would write down the memory that object carried. Not a summary, not a list of facts, a proper account, with as much detail as I could recover of the specific. The first entry in the notebook dates from a Tuesday evening in November. I remember that evening with a precision I cannot entirely account for, because it was not a remarkable evening in any outward sense. Eleanor was sitting in her chair by the sitting room window, wearing the burgundy shawl she kept around her shoulders through most of that time of year, a shawl she had bought from a small shop on Stonegate, perhaps 20 years earlier, and had continued wearing long after any fashion consideration had moved on, simply because it was warm and she loved it. She was reading, or trying to read. I say trying because by that period, concentration sometimes slipped away from her mid-page, and she would sit there with the book open and her eyes resting on the words, somewhere between the text and a thought I couldn't reach. I had sat down at my desk in the study with the new notebook in front of me and the pen in my hand, and I had looked at the first blank page for a considerable time before I began. The first object I chose was a teacup, not a remarkable cup, an ordinary one, white with a narrow blue border, slightly chipped on the handle for at least 15 years. Eleanor had always refused to throw it away. She said a chipped cup that still holds tea has more than proved its worth, and that it would be ungrateful to discard it on the grounds of an imperfection acquired through honest use. It was a perfectly characteristic opinion of Eleanor's, and I noted it word for word before I even began the entry properly. I wrote for an hour and a half. I hadn't intended to write for that long. But memory, I discovered that evening, doesn't work like a file you open and close neatly. It works like a network. You pull on one thread and 3 others come with it, and each of those holds others, and before you understand what's happening, you've traced 20 years of shared life back through a chipped teacup. That first entry ran to 7 pages. I went to bed that night with the strange and difficult-to-name feeling of having done something important without being able to say precisely what. Eleanor was already asleep when I came upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark and listened to her breathe, that familiar, ordinary sound that had accompanied nearly every night of my life for more than 5 decades. And I thought that if I had known from the beginning what I was learning now, namely that the ordinary things are precisely the ones that disappear first and hurt most when they're gone, I might have paid closer attention, not to the grand occasions, to the ordinary nights. Now I need to tell you something about York at that time of year, because the setting matters in this story, and because I don't think you can properly understand the rhythm of my life at that point without understanding something about the city in which that life was taking place. York in autumn is its own particular thing, not the city that tourists encounter in summer, with the queues along the shambles and the visitors raising their phones toward the minster. In autumn, the city reclaims something of itself. The stones take on a different color under the November light, a deeper shade, more honest, as if the city stops performing and simply becomes what it is. The old Roman walls that run around the city center have that quality all year round, but in autumn it becomes especially legible. There is something in those walls that reminds you that cities, like people, have a depth that their surface does not fully disclose. I walk every morning. I have walked every morning for more than 30 years, a habit formed when I worked at the Minster Library, and the walk-in was both my commute and my mental preparation for the day. Now that I am retired, the walk has no necessary destination, but it remains. You don't easily lose a good habit once you've understood why you adopted it. The morning after the evening Naomi had sold Eleanor's ring, I left the house early, before anyone else was awake, and I walked to Museum Gardens. The Museum Gardens are, in my considered view, one of the most genuinely beautiful places in England. Not spectacularly beautiful, not the kind of place you photograph to impress someone, but the kind of beauty that settles into you if you give it sufficient time. The ruins of St. Mary's Abbey at the far end, the ancient trees surrounding them, the River Ouse visible between branches at certain angles, it all amounts to something I can only call dignity. The dignity of a place that has been through considerable things and makes no particular drama of it. I walked slowly that morning. There was almost no one about. A man on the far side of the gardens with a dog, a woman on a bench with a book she wasn't quite reading. The ground was covered in wet leaves that muffled the sound of footsteps, and the abbey ruins stood against a pale sky, with the particular stillness that old stone achieves when no one is performing at it. I sat on the bench near the south wall of the abbey. It is a bench I've known for 40 years or more. Eleanor and I sat there on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted, with coffee in a flask and, for many years, the Sunday papers, which we exchanged without asking, having developed over time a perfectly intuitive rotation of sections. I sat there and thought about the ring, not with anger, which is perhaps what some people might have expected. I want to be honest about this, because I think honesty about actual emotions, not the emotions one is supposed to feel, or would appear more interesting for feeling, is the only thing that gives a story its genuine value. What I felt, sitting on that bench in the museum gardens that morning, was closer to grief than anger, an additional layer of grief, set down on top of the grief that had never fully lifted since Eleanor passed, because the ring was not merely a ring, and Naomi's sentence, someone who's gone doesn't need gold anymore, was not merely an opinion about jewelry. It was a statement about what she believed memory was worth, about whether the things that carry meaning deserve to be treated differently from the things that merely carry value. And I found, sitting there in the autumn quiet of the gardens with the abbey ruins in front of me, and the old city going about its mourning all around, that I could not simply let that statement stand unchallenged, not for any legal reason, not yet, but for a simpler and more fundamental one, because Eleanor had needed gold, not the metal itself. Eleanor had never been a woman who cared about gold as a material, but the object that gold had become over 53 years, the particular weight and warmth of it, the way she used to turn it on her finger when she was thinking about something, a habit so long established that she continued doing it even in the last months, when so many other habits had faded. as if the ring was connected to something deeper than conscious memory. I stayed in the gardens for about an hour. Then I walked home along Bootham and made myself breakfast, and sat at the kitchen table and thought carefully about what I intended to do. And here is what I decided, in the quiet of that kitchen, on that gray York morning. I was not going to do anything hastily. I was not going to make accusations or demands or scenes. I was going to do what I have done with every difficult problem in my working life. I was going to gather the full picture first and understand it completely, and only then decide how to move. I picked up the telephone and called Gerald Hawthorne. Gerald and I have known each other for nearly 50 years. We were at university together, both reading history, both with a particular interest in the medieval period, which was either a fortunate coincidence or the reason we became friends, depending on how you look at it. He went into law. I went into books. We have met for lunch on the first Wednesday of every month for more than 3 decades, excepting only illness and one memorable occasion when Gerald was unexpectedly required to attend a hearing in London and sent his apologies by handwritten note, which is exactly the kind of thing Gerald does, and which I have always found characteristic of him in the best possible way. He is 74 years old and has practiced estate law in York for the better part of 4 decades. He has an office near Micklegate that he has occupied since the early 1980s, in a building that has the same quality as Gerald himself, slightly worn at the edges, deeply solid, unlikely to be improved by renovation. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Edmund," he said, "you're calling on a Thursday morning. That's unusual." "Something's happened," I said. "Nothing urgent, but something I think you should know about." A pause. "Shall I come to you, or will you come here?" he said. This is one of the things I've always valued most about Gerald. He doesn't ask what it is before deciding whether it warrants his attention. He simply decides that if I have called on a Thursday morning, it warrants his attention, and proceeds from there. "I'll come to you," I said. "Tomorrow morning, if you have time." 9:30, he said. "I'll have Patricia clear the first hour." I thanked him and set down the phone. That afternoon, I went to the conservation workshop at the Minster as usual. I want to tell you about this, because it matters to understanding who I am and how I move through difficult things. Some people, when they are dealing with something painful, withdraw from their routines. They find the ordinary texture of the day impossible to maintain when something beneath it has shifted. I am not that kind of person. I find the ordinary texture of the day, in difficult times, more necessary than ever. Not as a distraction, I'm not trying to avoid thinking about the thing, but as a ground to stand on while I think about it. The work at the Minster that afternoon involved a collection of early 18th century parish records from a village near Harrogate that had been donated to the archive after the closure of the local church, water damage along the lower margins, some foxing, a few pages where the ink had bled badly enough to obscure the text. Careful, exacting, deeply satisfying work, the kind where an hour passes without your noticing. I worked beside a man named Arthur Fenwick, who had retired from a career in paper conservation at the British Library in London and had moved to York about 6 years ago to be nearer to family. Arthur is 68, precise in everything he does, with a dry humor he deploys rarely enough that when it appears it always takes you by surprise. We had developed the easy, companionable silence of people who work well together and have stopped needing to fill the quiet with conversation. At some point in the late afternoon, Arthur looked up from the document he was working on and said, without any particular preamble, "You're thinking about something." "I usually am," I said. "Something different today," he said, and went back to work. That was all. But it struck me on the walk home that one of the quiet gifts of getting older, if you are fortunate enough to do it in the company of people who pay genuine attention, is that you become legible to those people in ways that would have surprised you at 30. Your inner life shows in the set of your shoulders, and the rhythm of your work, and the particular quality of your silences. And the people who know you well can read those things the way I read watermarks. Jonathan was in the sitting room when I got home. Alone, Naomi was out somewhere. The house had her particular absence about it, which is a different quality from my ordinary solitude. Jonathan was sitting in the armchair by the window with a glass of water, not reading, not doing anything on his phone, simply sitting in the way that a person sits when they have been thinking hard about something and have not yet reached any conclusions. He looked up when I came in. "Dad," he said. "Jonathan," I said. I took off my coat and came into the room and sat in the chair opposite him, Eleanor's chair, which I use now without the discomfort it once caused me, having arrived, gradually, at the understanding that avoiding a chair is not the same as honoring the person who sat in it. We sat quietly for a moment. "I want to say something about yesterday," he said finally. "About the ring." "All right," I said. "I didn't know," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't know she was going to do it. I didn't know she had done it until you asked her. And when she told you, when I heard what she said—" He stopped, looked at his hands. I didn't know how to respond to it in the moment. So I left the room, which was the wrong thing to do, and I want you to know that I know that. I looked at my son. Jonathan is 52 years old. He is a careful, conscientious man who has spent his professional life making precise assessments of complex situations. Chartered surveying is not, despite what people sometimes assume, a simple profession. It requires the ability to look at something and see not only what it is, but what it represents, what it implies, what its history has done to its present condition. He is good at that, what he is less naturally gifted at. And I say this with complete affection, because I recognize the tendency as something he inherited from me, is knowing what to do with his own emotional responses in real time. He processes slowly. He needs space before he can speak honestly. The instinct to leave the room rather than say something inadequate is one I understand entirely, because it is also mine. "I know you didn't know," I said. "That doesn't make it all right," he said. "No," I said, "it doesn't, but it matters." He nodded. We sat quietly for another moment. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to see Gerald tomorrow morning," I said. Jonathan absorbed that. Are you thinking about it legally?" "I'm going to understand my position first," I said, "before I decide anything. I'm not going to react before I understand." He nodded again, slowly, in the way that told me he recognized the principle, because it was one he'd heard articulated in this house since he was old enough to understand principles. "All right," he said. "All right, Dad. Now, if you are watching this and you find yourself moved by what Edmund is carrying in this story, I want to ask you something simple. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. There are more stories coming that are built around exactly these kinds of moments. The quiet, difficult, deeply human moments that don't make headlines, but that change everything. Hit the button and the bell beside it, and stay with us, because what happens next in this story is not what you are expecting. I can promise you that. Gerald's office on Micklegate has the particular quality of having been arranged once, long ago, by someone with a clear sense of how things should be, and then simply maintained. Dark wood shelves lining 3 walls, every inch occupied by files and volumes, and the occasional object that had found its way there over the decades. A desk that is not tidy but is organized. There is a difference, and Gerald embodies it. A single window looking onto the street below, through which the sounds of York filter in at a useful remove. He was waiting for me when I arrived. Patricia, his secretary, a precise and quietly formidable woman who has worked for him for nearly 20 years, and who I suspect could run the practice entirely unaided if the need arose, showed me through with the smooth efficiency she brings to everything. Gerald stood and shook my hand. "Sit down, Edmund. Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the display case and the open door and the missing ring. I told him what Naomi had said, in the exact words she had used, because I had written them in the notebook the previous evening, and they were therefore precise in my memory. I told him about Jonathan leaving the room. I told him about going upstairs to the study and opening the notebook, and Naomi appearing in the doorway. Gerald listened to all of it without interrupting. He has the same quality in this respect as the best craftsman I have known. He does not reach for a conclusion before the information has been fully delivered. He waits until he has the complete picture. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Edmund, I need to ask you something about the notebook, not about its contents, about its history. How long have you been keeping it, and why did you begin?" I explained. The evenings with Eleanor as her memory began to change. The conversation at the kitchen table. Her particular fear, not of forgetting, but of the things being gone once they were forgotten. The promise I had made, the first entry, the chipped teacup, the 7 pages. Gerald listened to this with an attention that was slightly different from the attention he had given the first part of my account. It was more focused, more alert, in some quiet, professional way, as if something had arrived that he recognized as significant. "And the ring," he said. "Is it in the notebook?" "Yes," I said. "There is an entry for it, more than one, in fact." "When were those entries written?" "The first one was written approximately 2.5 years before Eleanor died," I said. "The most recent was written on the evening I removed both rings after her funeral." Gerald picked up his pen. He didn't write anything with it. He simply held it and looked at the window for a moment, in the way he does when something is taking shape in his thinking, and he is giving it the necessary room to arrive properly. "Edmund," he said finally, "I think I need to read the entries about the ring." "I thought you might," I said. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and produced 3 folded pages. I had copied them out by hand the previous evening after my conversation with Jonathan, sitting at the walnut desk in the study with the notebook open beside me. I had copied them carefully, exactly as a bookbinder copies, attending to every word, every pause, every particular. I placed them on the desk. Gerald unfolded them. He read the first page. He read it slowly, and I watched something happen in his expression, not dramatically, not with any performance, just the slight, unmistakable shift of a man who has been a professional for 40 years, encountering something that crosses the line between the technical and the genuinely human. He finished the first page. He looked up at me briefly. Then he went back to the pages. He read all 3. When he finished, he set them down on the desk and sat for a moment with his hands folded and said nothing. The sounds of Micklegate came through the window, a delivery vehicle, someone's footsteps on the pavement, the ordinary sounds of a city carrying on. "Edmund," Gerald said at last, "these are not merely personal records." He picked up his pen properly now and drew the notepad toward him. "In my view, these entries constitute documented evidence of sentimental ownership and declared intent spanning several years prior to the sale of the ring. The emotional history they contain is verifiable through their dating, their specificity, and their internal consistency." He paused. "In short, whoever sold that ring did not have the authority to sell it, and we can demonstrate that with a precision that goes considerably beyond what courts typically encounter in cases of this kind." I looked at him. "I don't want to destroy anyone," I said. He looked at me steadily. "I know you don't," he said. "That is precisely why I think we should proceed, because the people who don't want to destroy anyone are the ones who handle these things with the dignity they deserve." He wrote something on the notepad. Then he looked up. "There's one more thing I'd like to know," he said. "The buyer, the person Naomi sold the ring to, has she told you who it was?" "Not by name," I said. "She mentioned a specialist in antique jewelry." "I'd like that name," he said, "because before any other step is taken, I'd like to know whether that ring still exists in its current form, or whether it has already been altered or resold." I nodded. "I'll find out," I said. I walked home from Gerald's office through the center of York, taking the longer route along the Shambles, the way I sometimes do when I need the particular medicine of that street. Its narrowness, its antiquity, the way it refuses to be anything other than exactly what it has always been, despite every pressure the modern world brings to bear on it. The timber-framed buildings leaning toward each other overhead, the stone flags underfoot worn smooth by centuries of use. I walked slowly, and I thought about what Gerald had said, and I thought about Eleanor, and I thought about the notebook sitting in the drawer of the walnut desk at home, with its more than 1,000 entries, each one a thread pulled from the fabric of a shared life, each one proof that the ordinary things, the chipped cups and pressed flowers and worn shawls and gold rings, were never merely things at all. They were the places where the memories lived, and somewhere in York, in the hands of a specialist in antique jewelry whose name I did not yet know, was one of those places. I turned that fact over in my mind, the way you turn a difficult problem in the workshop, steadily, without forcing it, waiting for the angle from which it becomes workable. The answer, I was beginning to think, might depend on something I hadn't yet asked, something that Jonathan, in his quiet way, might know more about than he had so far said. I did not ask Jonathan that evening. I want to explain why, because it might seem like an obvious thing to do, to simply sit down with my son and ask him directly what he knew about the buyer, about Naomi's business dealings, about the particular chain of decisions that had led to Eleanor's ring being removed from the display case and placed in the hands of a stranger. It would have been the efficient thing, the direct thing. And I am, by nature and by profession, a man who tends toward directness. But there are moments in a family's life when efficiency is not the right instrument, when the direct question, however reasonable it appears, arrives before the ground is ready to receive it, and does more damage than the thing it was trying to address. I had learned this over 53 years of marriage, to a woman who understood human timing far better than I did. Eleanor always said that the right question asked at the wrong moment is indistinguishable from an accusation. And I had, over those same years, gradually learned to trust the principle even when my instinct was to move faster. Jonathan needed time. I could see that. He had been sitting with something uncomfortable since the previous evening, carrying the particular weight of a man who has discovered that a situation he thought he understood has a dimension he hadn't seen. I knew that weight, I knew its texture, and I knew that pressing on it prematurely would not produce honesty. It would produce defensiveness, which looks similar from the outside, but leads somewhere entirely different. So I let that evening pass quietly. Naomi came home in the late afternoon with several large, flat packages wrapped in brown paper, new stock for the business by the look of it, and moved through the house with the brisk purposefulness that characterized her on working days. She said good evening to me in the hall, with the same composed ease she had used since the first day Jonathan brought her to this house, and I said good evening in return, and we went about the remainder of the evening in the particular careful manner of two people who are both aware that something significant is unresolved between them, and have both, for different reasons, elected not to address it immediately. I spent the evening in the study. I opened the notebook and read through the entries I had copied for Gerald, not because I needed to read them again, but because rereading them had become, over the years, a practice with its own particular value. It was not nostalgia, exactly. It was something more deliberate than that. It was the act of keeping something alive through attention, the same principle that underlies the best conservation work, the understanding that things do not endure passively, that endurance requires active maintenance, and that the most important things to maintain are often the ones that have no obvious exterior surface to show for it. The first entry I had copied for Gerald described the morning I proposed to Eleanor. We had been walking in the museum gardens on a Sunday in early March, a cold morning, frost still on the grass in the shaded areas, the abbey ruins very white against a pale sky. I had been carrying the ring in my coat pocket for 11 days. I had bought it from a jeweler on Stonegate, whose shop has since closed, though the building is still there, now occupied by something that sells scented candles and decorative cushions. The ring was a plain gold band, slightly wider than the conventional style, which Eleanor had once mentioned in passing she found more elegant. I had remembered that. I had gone back to the jeweler 3 times before I settled on it. I had not planned what I was going to say. This was not, looking back, an oversight. It was consistent with everything I understand about how the most important moments in a life actually arrive, not through careful preparation, but through a quality of readiness that is different from preparation. You become ready by being fully present in the moment when the moment comes, not by having rehearsed what to do in it. We had stopped near the south wall of the abbey. Eleanor was looking at the stonework. She always looked at old stonework with a particular attention that I found, even then, deeply characteristic of her. She was studying the way the mortar had been applied between courses of stone, which is exactly the kind of thing Eleanor would study while standing in a frost-covered park on a Sunday morning in March. I said her name. She turned around, and I took the ring out of my pocket and held it toward her, and said the simplest possible version of what I wanted to say, which was that I could not imagine any version of my life worth living that did not have her in the middle of it, and that I hoped she felt similarly, and that if she did, I would be grateful beyond my ability to express if she would consent to making that arrangement permanent. She looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Then she laughed, not the polite social laugh, but the real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine and unguarded, and that I had already, in the 2 years we had been together, come to consider one of the great privileges of my existence. "Edmund," she said, "you just proposed marriage using the word consent." "I did," I said. "I find that extremely you," she said. "Is that a yes?" I said. "Of course it's a yes," she said. I had written all of that in the notebook 3 years before she died, sitting at this same desk in this same study on a Tuesday evening, and reading it back that night. It was as precise and present as it had been the day I wrote it. I closed the notebook carefully and went to bed. The following morning I walked to Bishopthorpe Road. Bishopthorpe Road is one of those streets in York that the city's visitors rarely find their way to, which is part of what makes it worth knowing. It runs south from the center, past Victorian terraces and independent shops, and a particular collection of cafes and small businesses that have the quality of places that have survived, because they are genuinely good at what they do, rather than because they have any particular advantage of location or marketing. There is a bookshop there that I have been visiting for nearly 20 years, a proper bookshop, the kind with narrow aisles and overfilled shelves, and a proprietor who actually reads what he sells. His name is Malcolm Hurst. He is 66, bearded, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who has found, in his working life, the thing he was supposed to be doing and has been doing it ever since. I go to Malcolm's shop when I need to think. This is not, I should say, the primary purpose of a bookshop, but I suspect it is one of the less acknowledged functions that independent bookshops have always served, as places where the act of moving slowly through shelves and handling books and existing in a room that is entirely organized around the value of careful attention has a settling effect on whatever the mind is currently trying to work through. Malcolm was behind the counter when I came in, cataloging a recent acquisition, a collection of Victorian travel writing, from the look of the spines. He looked up and nodded in the way he always does, which manages to convey welcome without interrupting anything, and I began moving through the shelves in the quiet that I value about that shop above almost anything else it offers. I was there for about 40 minutes before Malcolm appeared at the end of the aisle with 2 cups of tea. "Sit down for a minute," he said. We sat on the 2 chairs he keeps near the window for exactly this purpose. "You've got something on your mind," he said. "I usually do," I said. "Something particular," he said. I looked at him. Malcolm Hurst is not a man I have discussed private matters with extensively. Our friendship exists primarily within the particular world of books and manuscripts, and the conversation that naturally grows from shared enthusiasm for those things. But there is a quality he has, a quality I associate with people who spend their lives genuinely listening to what is written rather than skimming it, of patient, non-intrusive attention. He doesn't ask questions. He simply makes space, and people fill it according to their own judgment. I told him about the ring, not the legal dimensions, not Gerald's assessment or the documentation or any of that. Just the simple fact of it, the display case, the open door, what Naomi had said. Someone who's gone doesn't need gold anymore. Malcolm listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that has stayed with me in the months since, and that I want to tell you because I think it's one of those observations that sound simple, but contain rather a lot. He said, "The problem with treating everything as merchandise is that you eventually forget there's a difference between price and worth. And once you've forgotten that, you can't remember it just by being told. You have to learn it the slow way." I thought about that. "What's the slow way?" I said. He looked out at the street for a moment. "Contact with the things that can't be priced," he said. "Over time, without shortcuts." I drank my tea and sat with that observation, and felt it settle into my thinking, alongside everything else that was already there. Now, and I want to say this to you directly, because I think if you've stayed with this story this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is for. If Edmund's story is speaking to something in your own experience, something about the things in your life that carry meaning that can't be measured, then I want to ask you to do something simple. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And if you feel moved to, leave a comment below. Tell us about an ordinary object in your life that carries a story. A cup, a ring, a book, a coat. Because I believe, genuinely, that the most important archive in the world is the one that exists in the everyday memories of ordinary people. And those stories deserve to be told. I walked home from Malcolm's shop along the river path, which takes longer than the direct route, but has the advantage of the Ouse moving beside you for most of it. That steady, unhurried movement that has always had a clarifying effect on whatever I'm carrying in my thinking. The city was going about its late morning business, cyclists on the path, a narrowboat moving slowly downstream with that particular purposeful patience that narrowboats always convey, the towers of the Minster visible above the rooftops from certain angles, as they are from almost everywhere in York if you know where to look. Jonathan was in the kitchen when I got home. He had made coffee, proper coffee, not the instant that Naomi preferred, which meant he had taken the time to use the small Italian stovetop pot that had lived on the back shelf for years, and that I used every morning but that Jonathan only reached for when he was in a particular frame of mind. He looked up when I came in and gestured toward the pot with a slight lift of his chin, and I got a cup and sat down across from him. We sat quietly for a moment. Then Jonathan said, "She told me this morning." I waited. "More of it," he said. "Than she'd said to you the other evening." I held the coffee cup and said nothing. "The buyer's name is Philip Morrow," Jonathan said. "He runs a small business, antique and vintage jewelry, mainly estate pieces. He has a premises on Gillygate. Naomi has been dealing with him for about 8 months. He sources pieces for her online business, as well as buying from her. It's a trading relationship." He looked at his coffee. "She knew him well enough to approach him directly when she decided to sell the ring." "When she decided," I said. Jonathan looked up. "Yes," he said. "It wasn't impulsive. She'd thought about it. She told me this morning that she'd been looking at the display case for some time and thinking that the gold was just sitting there, that it wasn't serving any purpose, that if it could be turned into capital for the business, it would be more useful than—" He stopped. "Than memory," I said. He set his cup down. "Dad," he said, "I'm not defending it. I want to be completely clear about that. I'm not defending any of it. I'm just telling you what she told me because I think you deserve to know the full picture." "I know," I said, "and I appreciate it." "Philip Morrow still has the ring," Jonathan said. She confirmed that. It hasn't been resold. He had a potential buyer express interest, but the sale hasn't been completed. I absorbed this. Jonathan, I said carefully, how did Naomi seem when she told you all of this? He thought about it honestly, the way Jonathan thinks about things, not quickly, but thoroughly. She seemed, he said slowly, like someone who has started to realize that the way she'd explained it to herself might not be the only way of explaining it, that there might be another account of what happened that she hadn't been considering. I nodded. That's something, I said. He looked at me with an expression that I recognized, the expression of a man who loves two people who are in conflict with each other and is discovering that this situation has no easy geometry. What are you going to do? He asked. I spoke to Gerald yesterday, I said. He's going to look at the legal position, what the notebook establishes in terms of documented intent and emotional ownership, whether the sale can be challenged and on what grounds. Jonathan processed this. And separately from the legal position, I said, I'm going to ask to meet Philip Morrow. Jonathan looked up. Not to accuse him of anything, I said quickly. He bought from someone who presented herself as having the authority to sell. That's not his wrongdoing. But I want to meet the man who has Eleanor's ring in his possession. I want him to know what it is he has. We sat with that for a moment. Do you think that will change anything? Jonathan said. I think, I said, that there are some things in the world that change when they are properly understood, and some that don't. And the only way to find out which this is to ensure that the proper understanding is available. Jonathan looked at me for a long moment. And then he said something that surprised me, and that I have thought about many times since. She's not a bad person, Dad, he said. I want you to know that doesn't excuse what she did. But she's not a bad person. She stopped seeing things properly. At some point, she started looking at everything through the lens of what it could become, rather than what it was. He paused. I don't know when that started. I've been trying to remember. He said the last sentence very quietly, almost to himself, and I thought about Malcolm Hurst's observation about the things that can't be priced, and about the slow way of learning the difference, and about the particular mercy of being in a situation where that learning is still possible. I walked to Gillygate that afternoon. Philip Morrow's premises occupied a narrow shop front between a framing gallery and a small independent wine merchant. The window display was carefully arranged, several pieces of antique jewelry on dark velvet stands, a few small decorative objects, a handwritten card describing the provenance of a pocket watch, the kind of window that is designed for people who look carefully, rather than people who simply pass. I stood outside it for a moment. Then I went in. The shop was small and very quiet, with glass cases along the walls and the particular hushed atmosphere that small specialist shops often have, a sense of concentrated attention, of things being taken seriously. A man appeared from the back room. 50s, I judged. Careful manner, good quality but unpretentious clothes, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the kind of person who knows exactly what he has and why it matters without needing to make a performance of knowing. Mr. Morrow, I said. He looked at me with the politely attentive expression of a shopkeeper who has not yet placed a visitor, but is giving them the full benefit of his attention in the meantime. I'm Edmund Carlyle, I said. I believe you recently acquired a piece from Naomi Carlyle, a Victorian gold wedding band. Something moved in his expression. Not guilt, something more subtle than guilt. The expression of a man who has, perhaps, been sitting with a small, unresolved question about a transaction, and has just been given notice that the question is about to be answered. Why don't you sit down? He said. He brought 2 chairs from the back room and set them near the front of the shop, away from the main cases. He sat down across from me with the attentive, unhurried manner of someone who has decided to give a conversation the time it requires. I told him about Eleanor. Not everything. Not the full 53 years, not the notebook, not the details that belong to us and not to this transaction. But enough. I told him how long we had been married. I told him about the ring and what it represented, and how it had been kept and what the display case was and why it had been where it was. I told him that I had not authorized the sale, and that I believed, on the advice of my solicitor, that the sale could be legally challenged. Philip Morrow listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had a feeling." I looked at him. "When Naomi brought it in," he said carefully, "there was something about the way she described it that didn't quite sit right. She said it was an inherited piece, that the original owner had passed some years ago, that the family had decided to release some items." He paused. "I've been in this business for a long time. You develop a sense for when a story is complete and when it has something missing from it." "And this one?" I said. "This one felt like it had something missing," he said. He stood and went to a small cabinet at the back of the room. He unlocked it and returned with a small white box. He set it on the case between us and opened it. The ring lay on a square of dark velvet inside the box. I looked at it. I had not seen it for 4 years, not since the evening after Eleanor's funeral, when I had placed it in the display case alongside my own. It looked exactly as I remembered it, the same slight width that was not quite the conventional style, the particular warm color of old gold that has been worn for many years against skin. I did not reach for it. "Mr. Morrow," I said, "I have a solicitor who will be in touch with you formally about the legal position. I'm not here to put pressure on you or to make this more difficult than it needs to be. You bought in good faith from someone who misrepresented her authority to sell. That is not your wrongdoing." He nodded. "But I want you to understand," I said, "what you have in that box." He looked at the ring. Then he looked at me. "Tell me," he said. And so I did. I told him about the museum gardens in March, about the frost on the grass and the abbey ruins white against a pale sky, about Eleanor looking at the stonework and turning around when I said her name, about the ring I had chosen because she had once, in passing, mentioned preferring a slightly wider band, and I had remembered. Philip Morrow sat very still while I told him. When I finished, he closed the box gently. "Mr. Carlyle," he said, "I haven't sold this piece. I won't sell it. Whatever your solicitor needs from me by way of cooperation, I'll provide without reservation." He paused. "And I owe you an apology," he said, "for not asking the questions I should have asked when it came in." I looked at him carefully. "You had a feeling," I said. "You said so yourself. That's not nothing." He nodded slowly. I left the shop on Gillygate and stepped back into the York afternoon. The street was busy with the ordinary commerce of a working day, people moving with purpose, a delivery van navigating the narrow road, the sky above the rooflines the particular pale gray that York does so well in autumn. I walked home along Bootham, past the walls, past the gate, past the stretch of pavement I had walked 10,000 times or more. The house came into view at the end of the street, the Victorian terrace that Eleanor and I had bought when we were young and deliberate, and had no real idea yet what 53 years in a single place would eventually come to mean. I stood outside it for a moment before going in. I thought about what Gerald had said, about what Malcolm had said, about Jonathan sitting at the kitchen table saying she stopped seeing things properly at some point, and I don't know when that started. And I thought about Naomi, moving through this house with her packages and her business logic and her carefully maintained surface, and I wondered whether somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the practicality and the commerce and the trained eye for what things could become, there was a person who had not yet had occasion to discover what things actually were. And I thought that perhaps, that occasion was closer than any of us had yet realized. But what I didn't know, walking up the path and putting my key in the lock of the house on Saint-Mary's, was what form that occasion was going to take. Gerald had said he needed one more piece of information before he could advise me on how to proceed formally, and when he told me what that piece of information was, I understood immediately that finding it was going to require a conversation I had been, without entirely knowing it, preparing for since the evening I first opened the notebook and wrote a date and a time at the top of a fresh page. Gerald called me on a Monday morning, 3 days after my visit to Philip Morrow's shop on Gillygate. I was in the study when the phone rang, sitting at the walnut desk with the notebook open in front of me, not writing, just reading back through entries from several years earlier, the way I sometimes did in the mornings before the day properly began. There is a particular quality to reading those pages that I cannot easily describe to someone who hasn't kept a record of this kind. It is not comfortable, exactly. It is not always pleasant, but it is honest in a way that very little else is, because the words were written by a version of myself who was fully present in the moment he was recording, and reading them back is therefore an act of genuine encounter with the past, with Eleanor, with the person I was becoming through the experience of loving someone well over a long time. I picked up the phone. "Edmund," Gerald said, "I've spoken with a colleague who specializes in property and personal effects law, and I've spent 2 days going through the documentation you've given me alongside the notebook entries. I think I'm ready to tell you what I believe the full legal position is, and then I'd like your decision on how you want to proceed." "Come to the house," I said, "this afternoon if you can." He arrived at 2 o'clock, punctual as he has always been, in his good wool coat and with his briefcase, and Patricia had apparently packed him a folder of notes because he produced one from the case and set it on the kitchen table with the efficient care of a man who has done this particular kind of work, the work of bringing clarity to painful situations, for long enough to know exactly what it requires. I made tea. This is not incidental. The making of tea in a difficult moment is not merely a social convention in England. It is, or it has always been for me, a deliberate act of pace setting. It says, we are going to take the time this deserves. We are not going to rush toward the answer before we have properly understood the question. Gerald waited until I had sat down. Then he opened the folder. "The legal position," he said, "is clearer than these situations often are, and that clarity is almost entirely due to the notebook." He looked at me over his glasses. "Under English law, personal property, including jewelry, cannot be sold by a third party without the explicit consent of the owner, regardless of that third party's relationship to the owner or their physical access to the property. The authorization to sell does not derive from proximity or from a general sense of household management. It derives from documented consent." "There was no consent," I said. "There was no consent," he confirmed. "And the notebook establishes not only the ownership of the ring, but the declared sentimental intent surrounding it, in writing, with dates, over a period of several years prior to the sale. That is a significantly stronger evidentiary position than simply asserting that the ring was yours. It demonstrates the context in which the ring existed and the clearly stated significance that was attached to it." He turned a page in the folder. "Philip Morrow has confirmed in writing, I received his letter this morning, that he will cooperate fully, that he has removed the ring from sale, and that he purchased in good faith without being informed that the seller lacked authority. He is, in legal terms, an innocent party in this transaction." "I know that," I said. "I told him as much when I met him." Gerald looked at me with the expression he occasionally produces when I do something he had anticipated, but had not been certain I would actually do. "Yes," he said. "He mentioned your visit. He said," Gerald glanced at his notes, "that your account of the ring's history was the most persuasive argument for the importance of provenance he had encountered in 30 years of trading in antique pieces." I looked at the table. "Gerald," I said, "what is the formal process from here?" "There are 2 paths," he said. "The first is a civil claim, straightforward, well supported by the documentation, and likely to result in financial compensation and the return of the ring. It would involve a formal hearing. Both parties would be required to appear or to be represented. And the second path? I said. The second is a private resolution, he said. A formal written acknowledgement of what occurred, a documented agreement regarding the return of the ring, and a structured conversation, witnessed by me, in which the facts are laid out plainly and the relevant party is given the opportunity to respond to them before any formal legal step is taken. I looked at him. You're recommending the second, I said. I'm not recommending anything, he said, with the precise professional care that has always characterized him. I'm presenting both options with equal completeness. What I will say is that in 40 years of practice, the cases that end well, that produce genuine resolution rather than technical victory, are almost always the ones where the human dimension is addressed alongside the legal one, rather than instead of it. We sat quietly for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the back garden was in its November state. The rosebush Eleanor had planted along the south wall bare now, the apple tree stripped, the small stone bench near the wall, holding its patient position through the cold, the way it always did. I thought about what Jonathan had said. She stopped seeing things properly at some point. I don't know when that started. I thought about what Malcolm had said. You have to learn it the slow way, through contact with the things that can't be priced, over time, without shortcuts. I thought about Philip Morrow sitting across from me in his quiet shop, saying, "Tell me," and listening, with complete attention, while I described a morning in March in the museum gardens with frost on the grass, and Eleanor turning around when I said her name. And I made my decision. I want to speak to Naomi, I said. Before anything formal, I want to sit down with her, here, in this house, and I want to read her something from the notebook, and then I want to hear what she says. Gerald looked at me steadily. All right, he said. I'd like you there, I said, not as her adversary, as a witness, and as my solicitor, so that whatever is said carries its proper weight. I can do that, he said. And Jonathan should be there, I said, not because this is his responsibility, but because he is my son, and because whatever happens between Naomi and me will affect him, and he deserves to be present for it. Gerald nodded. He picked up his pen and made a note. When? He said. Friday evening, I said. Give her time to understand that it's coming. I'm not interested in ambush. I want her to have the opportunity to arrive at this conversation, having genuinely thought about it. Gerald looked up from his notepad. Edmund, he said, in 41 years of legal practice, I have sat across from a great many people in situations of this kind. And I want to tell you something, as your friend, rather than your solicitor. He looked at me directly. The approach you are taking is not the easy one. It requires considerably more of you than the straightforward legal path would. It requires you to extend a quality of consideration to someone who did not extend that quality to you, and it requires you to do this without any guarantee of the outcome. I know that, I said. I want to make sure you know it clearly, he said, because in my experience, people sometimes choose the generous approach in these situations, imagining that generosity will be met with gratitude, or with an immediate change of heart, or with the kind of response that makes the generosity feel rewarded in a direct and satisfying way. He paused. It doesn't always work like that. No, I said. It doesn't. But Eleanor didn't teach me to be generous when it was likely to be rewarded. She taught me to be generous because it was the correct way to live. And I am not prepared to abandon that principle because someone tested it. Gerald held my gaze for a moment. Then he closed his folder and picked up his tea. Friday evening, he said. I'll be here at 7. The days between that Monday and Friday had their own particular quality. Not tense exactly, but heightened. The ordinary texture of the days felt slightly more present than usual, as if the approaching conversation had sharpened the edges of things. I noticed the light more carefully. I noticed the sounds of the house, the particular creak of the second stair, the way the kitchen window rattles very slightly when the wind comes from the north. I noticed the display case beside the fireplace with its single ring, and the empty square of dark velvet beside it, and I thought about what I intended to do about both of those things. I spent 2 evenings choosing what to read from the notebook. This was careful work, not because the entries were difficult to find. I know the notebook's geography the way I know the streets of York, by long familiarity, but because choosing the right 3 entries required me to think carefully about what I was trying to achieve. I was not trying to produce guilt. I was not trying to humiliate or overwhelm. I was trying to do something far more precise and far more demanding than that. I was trying to make someone understand the difference between value and meaning. And that is not a thing you can accomplish through argument, or through legal documentation, or through the straightforward presentation of facts, however well organized those facts might be. It is a thing you can only attempt through the specific, concrete, irreducible particularity of a true story, told fully and without evasion. The first entry I chose was the museum gardens, the morning in March with the frost on the grass and Eleanor turning around, the ring in my coat pocket where it had been for 11 days, the exact words she had said when I showed it to her, and the exact sound of the laugh that had preceded them. The second was from 4 years into our marriage, a Saturday afternoon, Eleanor unwell with a persistent cold and confined to the sitting room with the burgundy shawl and a stack of books she was too tired to read properly. I had come downstairs to make tea and had stood in the kitchen looking at the winter light in the garden, and I had been seized, unexpectedly and entirely without drama, by the most complete and uncomplicated gratitude I had ever experienced, not for anything in particular, for the whole of it, the house, the cold afternoon, the unwell woman in the sitting room, the particular shape my life had taken by choosing to build it alongside hers. I had stood in the kitchen for several minutes, simply feeling that. And then I had made the tea and taken it through, and Eleanor had looked up from her book and said thank you as if she knew exactly what the tea represented, which possibly she did. I had written that entry because of the ring, because Eleanor had been turning it on her finger that afternoon, that long-established unconscious habit, and it had been the ring that drew my attention to her hands, and her hands that had led me to the gratitude that I wanted to preserve. The third entry I chose was the last one, written on the evening after Eleanor's funeral, 4 years ago, in this same study, at this same desk. The entry began with the word alone, which was the simplest account I could give of the object that had entered the house that day, my own solitude, which had become an object as tangible and present as any piece of furniture. And it described the moment I had removed both rings, mine from my finger, Eleanor's from the small pocket of her dress that I had placed it in before the service, and had sat for a long time holding them both in my palm, and then had walked to the display case and placed them together on the dark velvet, and had stood looking at them for a while, and had said aloud in the empty room, a promise I will not repeat here, because it belongs to Eleanor, and to that room, and to no other audience. I had written all of it down, every word of it, in the careful, deliberate hand that 50 years of manuscript work had given me. That was the third entry. Friday evening arrived gray and still, the way November evenings in York tend to arrive. The city going dark early, the old stone holding what warmth it could against the cold. I lit the fire in the sitting room in the afternoon, which I do not do every day, but which felt right for this evening. The room needed to be warm. What was going to happen in it required the kind of warmth that a cold room cannot provide. Jonathan arrived at 6:30. He came into the kitchen, and I made tea, and we sat together for 20 minutes without talking very much, which was right, and which Jonathan understood without being told. He looked tired, not the tiredness of insufficient sleep, but the tiredness of someone who has been carrying something difficult for several days and has not been able to set it down. "Are you all right?" I said. "Yes," he said. Then, "I don't know. I will be." I nodded. Gerald arrived at 7 exactly. He came in quietly, took his coat off in the hall, accepted a cup of tea with a brief nod of thanks, and settled into the armchair near the window with his folder on his knee. Present but unobtrusive, the way a good solicitor manages to be when the room requires it. Naomi arrived 5 minutes later. She came into the sitting room with the composed manner that was so characteristic of her, the surface carefully maintained, and looked at the three of us, Jonathan in the chair by the fireplace, Gerald by the window, me standing near the table where I had placed the notebook, and understood, I think immediately, that this was not the kind of gathering she had been imagining. She sat down. I sat across from her. For a moment the room held nothing but the sound of the fire and the distant sounds of the city outside. Then I picked up the notebook. I did not open it immediately. I looked at Naomi for a moment and said, very quietly, the way I say most things, "I'm not going to accuse you of anything this evening, and I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself. What I'm going to do is read you 3 passages from this notebook, and then I'm going to sit quietly and let you respond to them however you choose. And after that, Gerald is going to explain the legal position, and we are going to make a decision together about what happens next." Naomi looked at the notebook. Something moved in her expression. A slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible adjustment in the set of her jaw. Not fear, exactly. Wariness. The wariness of someone who is beginning to understand that the conversation they are in is different in nature from the conversations they had prepared themselves for. I opened the notebook to the first marked page, and I read. I read about the museum gardens in March, about the frost on the grass and the abbey ruins white against the sky, about Eleanor turning around and saying, "Of course, it's a yes," with the real laugh, the unguarded one. I read it exactly as it was written, without performance, at the pace the words required. The room was completely still while I read. I turned to the second entry and read about the Saturday afternoon with the winter light in the garden, and the unguarded gratitude that had arrived without warning in the kitchen of this house, and about Eleanor turning the ring on her finger without knowing she was doing it, and about the tea taken through to the sitting room as the only language adequate to what I was feeling. I heard Jonathan very quietly set down his cup. I turned to the third entry. I read about the evening after the funeral, about the particular quality of the house that day, and the weight of the 2 rings in my palm, and the decision to place them together in the display case, and the promise spoken aloud in an empty room to a person who was no longer present to hear it. I closed the notebook. The fire made its small sounds. The city moved outside. I looked at Naomi, and what I saw in her face was something I had not seen there before in all the years I had known her. Not guilt, though guilt was there. Not embarrassment, though that was there too, visible in the color that had risen in her face while I was reading. What I saw was something rawer and less managed than either of those things. What I saw was recognition, the particular expression of a person who has just encountered something that has made them see their own actions from an angle they had not previously considered, not from the angle of legality or of social judgment or of any external standard, from the angle of meaning, of what a thing actually is, beneath and beyond what it can be sold for. She did not speak immediately. The silence lasted long enough that Jonathan shifted slightly in his chair, but I gave it the time it needed. When Naomi finally spoke, her voice was steady but reduced, quieter than her usual register, as if she was speaking from a place that didn't have room for its normal volume. "I didn't think of it as a story," she said. "When I looked at the case, at the ring, I saw an object. I saw gold. I calculated its age and its weight and its condition, and I thought about what it would bring." She stopped. "I didn't think of it as a story." "I know," I said. "That's not an excuse," she said quickly. "I know that too," I said. Gerald opened his folder with a quietness that managed not to interrupt the room's atmosphere. "I'd like to explain the legal position," he said, "and then I'd like to put a proposal on the table." He did so with the precise, unhurried clarity of a man who has 40 years of difficult conversations behind him. The unauthorized sale, the documented ownership, Philip Morrow's cooperation, the two paths, civil claim or private resolution. He outlined the private resolution in full, a formal written acknowledgement. The ring returned to its owner, a structured financial settlement to acknowledge the unauthorized transaction and its associated costs, all of it witnessed, documented, binding. Naomi listened to all of it without interrupting. When Gerald finished, she said, "I'll sign whatever needs to be signed. I'll pay whatever is owed. I'm not going to contest any of it." She looked at me. "Edmund," she said, "I want to ask you something. Not about the legal part, something else." "Go ahead," I said. "Why didn't you just go straight to a solicitor? Or to the police? Why this?" She gestured slightly, taking in the room, the notebook, the evening. "Why read to me from a notebook?" I looked at her for a moment. "Because," I said, "I didn't want to produce a legal outcome. I wanted to produce an understanding. Those are different things. A legal outcome tells you what must happen. An understanding tells you why it matters. And I'm too old, Naomi, to be satisfied with telling people what must happen without giving them the opportunity to understand why it matters." She looked at the notebook in my hands. "Would you—" she began, then stopped. "Would I what?" I said. "Would you read it to me again?" she said quietly. "The first one, about the museum gardens." I looked at her, and then I opened the notebook to the first marked page and read it again, about the frost on the grass, about the Abbey ruins, about Eleanor turning around with the real laugh. And this time, when I reached the words, "Of course it's a yes," Naomi put her hand briefly over her mouth and looked at the fireplace, and I saw her understand something in a way that no legal document could have produced. In the weeks that followed, Naomi did everything she had said she would do. The acknowledgement was signed. The financial settlement was made. Philip Morrow, whom Gerald had contacted formally, returned the ring to me personally, bringing it to the house on a Tuesday morning with a quiet dignity that I found genuinely moving. He shook my hand at the door and said he hoped the matter had reached a conclusion that was right. And I told him it had, and I meant it. I placed Eleanor's ring back in the display case on the dark velvet square beside my own. I stood and looked at both rings for a long while. Naomi did something else as well, something that had not been part of any agreement, formal or informal. She had been spending the week since the Friday evening differently. I could see it in the small ways people change when something has genuinely moved in them. She was quieter. She spent time in the sitting room rather than the back room. One evening I came downstairs and found her standing in front of the display case, looking at the rings, not touching the case, just looking. She didn't hear me in the doorway, and I didn't announce myself. I simply went back upstairs. Jonathan told me one morning that she had been making inquiries about the York Castle Museum, about a position they had recently advertised, cataloging donated family heirlooms, objects brought in by ordinary families, along with handwritten accounts of what those objects meant. She applied for the position in January. She was offered it 3 weeks later. She closed the vintage business quietly, professionally, without drama. She settled what could be settled, transferred what could be transferred, and handed back the keys to the premises she had rented near the station on a gray February morning with a composure that Jonathan said was entirely genuine. She started at the museum in March. I did not see her in those months as often as I had during the period she and Jonathan had been staying at the house. They had moved back to their own place. That had happened naturally, without any explicit conversation, simply the organic shift that follows a significant alteration in the way people relate to one another. Jonathan came by on Sundays, as he had always done, sometimes alone, sometimes with Naomi. When Naomi came, there was a different quality to her presence in the house, less surface, more interior. the particular change that comes over a person who has recently discovered something important and is still in the process of organizing their life around it. One afternoon in April, she arrived alone, which had not happened before. She came in and I made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table with the garden visible through the window, the rosebush beginning to show its first green along the bare branches. She said, "I cataloged something today that I keep thinking about." "Tell me," I said. "A woman brought in a pair of reading glasses," she said. "Ordinary glasses, nothing remarkable. She'd belonged to her husband, who died last year. She brought them in with a handwritten card that described the way he used to take them off and leave them on top of whatever book he was reading, face down to mark his place. She said she'd kept finding them like that for months after he died, in different rooms, because she kept forgetting he wasn't going to come back for them." She looked at her cup. "She wanted them preserved," she said. "Not because they were valuable, because of the story. Because without the story, they were just glasses." I looked at her. "Yes," I said. "Exactly." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm learning," she said simply. Not as an apology, and not as a plea for reassurance, just as a statement of fact. "I know," I said. The months passed with the particular rhythm that months acquire when the significant things in them are quiet rather than dramatic. The notebook continued. Every evening, as it had for years, I chose an object and wrote its memory. A doorknob, a particular brand of tea that Eleanor had preferred and that I still bought out of habit I had never examined. A pair of gardening gloves that had lived on the shelf in the kitchen since a spring afternoon 20 years ago, and that I could not bring myself to discard. And one evening in late summer, I wrote an entry I had not anticipated. The object I chose was the notebook itself. I had not written about the notebook before, had not thought of it as an object with its own story, because it had always been the container of the stories rather than one of them. But sitting at the walnut desk that evening in the late summer light with the garden amber outside the window, I understood that it had become one. That,